Hello and welcome to another lecture of Engineering 222. This is for Monday the 13th of October. So before we get into the discussion about incremental benefit cost analysis, I just wanted to review two important announcements. The first is that homework number 8 is due on Wednesday. And so if you have any questions about that, you can send me an email. Although I'm out of town, I did take my laptop, so I can address any questions you might have. And then the project's due on Wednesday the 19th. When I gave you the project, it seemed like that date was so far away, but now we're just over a month away. So you definitely need to get down to that and start making some progress on the project. So let me know if I can help.
I grew up in the 80s, and back then there wasn't a lot of entertainment available. We didn't have phones, there wasn't the internet, so you just watch the news. That was, like what you did when you were a kid, is might as well watch TV, and in the afternoon it's just the news. And I remember back in the 80s hearing about the $600 toilet seat. And basically there was all this renewed attention to government fraud and waste in the 80s because the government under Ronald Reagan started spending more and more money on defense. National defense, just basically their budget more than doubled over the course of a few years in the 80s. And with all of that extra spending, the accounting controls were relaxed. They didn't double the number of accountants to make sure that the contracts were reasonable and that people were being paid fair amounts for what they were providing. And so there was this big scandal in the 80s about how much money the government was spending on certain particular things, and the $600 toilet seat that went on board C-5 aircraft was a big story in the 80s. And unfortunately, the history of government waste continues to this day. One of the important issues of the presidential race, where Sarah Palin was the vice presidential candidate, people asked her about the bridge to nowhere. And the reason why it was significant for her is she was the governor of Alaska. And she was campaigning as kind of like an efficient government candidate, saying there's too much wasteful spending at the federal government level. But then when she was governor of Alaska, anytime there was federal money and handouts available, she very aggressively went after it. And the bridge to nowhere was a classic example of the Alaskan hunger for federal dollars. And basically what it is that in the Alaskan city of Ketchikan, most of the town is on one side of a body of water, and then the international airport is on the other side. And for years they've just had a ferry that goes back and forth between the two, and the ferry runs every 15 minutes for a round-trip ticket. I think was something like $7. But somebody proposed the idea that instead of the ferry, what if we built a road connecting the city of Ketchikan to the airport? And the estimated cost of that was going to be $400 million for that road. And they actually did start building it. They didn't finish the whole thing because what they finally realized is that the amount of benefit it was going to generate over the existing ferry system was so negligible that it couldn't justify the $400 million price tag to build a bridge to nowhere. But they did build a large segment of the road. They ended up spending about $28 million for 3 miles of road that actually didn't even get paved. That was just clearing the vegetation and doing some of the foundation work and putting in gravel. And you can kind of see the legacy of that road to nowhere. They don't have the bridge to nowhere, but here's the city of Ketchikan. It's a small town with an airport and just this road that doesn't have any drivers. And it was kind of an infamous story of wasteful government spending. Here closer to home in West Virginia, one of our recent brushes with government spending that's considered very wasteful was an incident a couple of years ago where the state of West Virginia used some federal grant money to buy high-capacity internet routers, more than 1,000 of them. And they were like $22,000 routers that in most cases were sent to very small libraries that had typically 3 computers. And so you're connecting like $1,000 worth of computers to a $22,000 router that was so complicated, the librarians didn't know how to set it up. In many cases, they didn't have the correct kind of fiber internet connection to make the router compatible. They bought all of these routers at once, the state did, and so they were just stuck in storage. They were paying storage because they couldn't get them installed and set up, so they had to pay for several years of storage of these 1,000 routers, and it was $24 million, and many of them aren't in use anymore. I mean, they would have been better off just going to Walmart and buying like the $60 like Netgear router than these $22,000 high capacity routers. And I mean, there's enough government waste and poor spending to basically drive you crazy, especially if you pay taxes. But what made this case especially egregious was that they only considered a single model. They didn't do the comparison of multiple alternatives. Just somebody heard that there was $24 million available, and the mindset is, well, if we don't spend that money, we're going to have to give it back. So we might as well spend it all on the best router that we can get with the money that's available. Not thinking that, number one, it's an embarrassment to the state to be spending money like that, but then also having an overcomplicated system is doing more harm than good if the people who are using it don't know how to install, maintain, or afford it. So what we're going to be talking about today is an extension of benefit cost analysis. And what we learned last time about the decision criteria is that when you have the net benefits in the numerator and the total costs in the denominator, then when that ratio is greater than 1, what it means is basically you're purchasing more than $1's worth of benefits for $1 of cost. And so the decision criteria is that you should only accept a project if, on an absolute basis, the B to C ratio is greater than 1. But you remember how you can't pick projects just because based on which one has the highest IRR? Like, that's one of the golden rules, that the IRR can be used for initial screening, but it can't be used to identify the option that's the best. The same thing is true for benefit cost analysis. If you have multiple alternatives, it isn't necessarily the one with the highest B to C ratio that is the alternative that you should select. What you have to do is you have to compare the alternatives to each other in an incremental way to know which alternative is the one that should be selected. And so the decision criteria for incremental benefit cost analysis is that you'll line them up from cheapest to most expensive, and then you keep going for the larger, more expensive alternative as long as the incremental B to C ratio is greater than 1. And by doing that, what you're going to basically achieve is anytime you can get more than $1 back in benefits for $1 of cost, you should do that. So, like, if someone says, I'll give you $5 if you give me $1, you should definitely do that. But like, how long should you do it? You should do it every time they're willing to give you more than $1. And so the same thing is true of incremental analysis of projects, that even if the incremental benefit between two projects only has an incremental B to C ratio of 1.1, you should still go for the larger alternative, because that means you're getting more than $1 of net benefits for the $1 of cost. So in incremental analysis for public sector projects, maybe if we were talking about flood control, we might compare a flood wall, which, let's just say hypothetically, is cheaper to build a flood wall compared to raising every structure in the town that needs to be protected. So this is an example of another thing that they do to protect against flooding, is they'll actually take an existing structure and lift it above the base flood elevation. And then another thing that they can do for flood protection would be to have gigantic pumps and the ability to de-water an area. So they do this in New Orleans for flood protection. When it rains, there are sections of New Orleans that would be below the water level of the surrounding lake and river, and so they have to have really powerful pumps in place in order to provide flood protection. So in incremental analysis, what we do is if we order them from cheapest to more expensive to most expensive, then we'll look at the incremental costs, the incremental benefits, the incremental disbenefits, and then compare alternatives one at a time. in the same way that when we did the incremental analysis before, we didn't necessarily know all of the matchups at the beginning. We can only set the matchups one at a time, because let's say if we were comparing these ones. If this is the base alternative, we're going to say flood wall versus raising the houses for the first matchup. But the second matchup, we don't know if it's going to be the flood wall or the lifting the houses, which is going to be used for the comparison against the pumping. So remember, it's very important not to try to set up all of the comparisons before you begin. You have to just do them one at a time to compare the alternatives. And so you're calculating these differences, and remember that the time frame of the money has to be the same to put it into the B to C ratio. So normally the initial cost will be expressed in terms of a lump sum at the present. But maintenance and operation, when you get that data, it's going to be on an annual basis. So you'll have to take that to the present to be able to combine it with the initial purchase price cost. And the same thing of the benefits and disbenefits. Those normally in the problem statement are going to be expressed on an annual basis, and you have to convert it. Either you have to convert the initial cost to annual so that it can be combined with the rest, which are in an annual basis, or you have to take everything to the present. So the money needs to be at the same time before you can put it into the B to C formula. And so this is how the formula changes if we're doing incremental analysis. You don't find the difference of the ratios themselves. It's not like you find the B to C of this one and the B to C of this one and then subtract the two. You find the incremental benefit, the incremental disbenefits, and so you're going to have a different number. You have to do the increment of the pieces, not the increment of the two wholes. And you'll see what I mean by that in just a moment when we work through this example. So any questions so far about kind of the mindset of incremental analysis? So we'll put it either, this is the conventional formula. We also looked at the modified in class last Wednesday. We'll normally just stick with the conventional formula. But the decision criteria is if the ratio for the increment is greater than 1, then you pick the more expensive alternative. And then it will be the baseline case, or the defender, so to speak, for follow-up comparisons after that. And if the incremental ratio is less than 1, then that means you're getting less than $1 of benefit for each $1 of cost, and therefore the more expensive alternative is not justified. So then you'd choose the cheaper alternative, and it would be the baseline case that the remaining alternatives are compared against. Okay, so let me hand out this paper for today, and you've got the template file that you downloaded from Blackboard. Okay, so the first thing you're going to have to do here is find the present worth of the initial costs. That's already as present. But you'll notice everything else is in annual terms. The maintenance and operation costs are annual. The benefits, you can add those all together. And then you're going to find the present worth of all of the benefits and the present worth of all of the disbenefits. It says here that the project lifespan is 75 years and 6% is the interest rate you need to apply. So find the present worth of everything and then calculate the conventional B to C ratio just to see if any of these 5 options should be rejected through initial screening. So do the initial screening here in part B, and then from there we'll do the incremental analysis.
Present worth. 75 years later, that's $3 million.
It's wrong. There you go. This one? Yeah. This is the initial, so it's 38 years. Figure it out.
One thing that you can do is you could do a function within a function. So like for these benefits, there's flood, fire, and annual recreation. So I'm doing the PV function. And so the interest rate, of course, is 6%, NPER is 75. But then for the in the PMT field, which is what I want to do, I want to put these amounts, they are payments, meaning a recurring annual series. So I'm just doing a parentheses and then adding them together. So it's a function inside of a function, and when you do that, then it'll find the present worth of the combined benefits. Let me mention another thing about the formatting of this template file. Like it's set to, the MAR is in terms of percentage, so it needs to be 6% and not 0.06%. So by default, it was already formatted as a percentage. So if it's as a percentage, then it should be 6 rather than 0.06.
Okay, so if you don't spreadsheet, you get like 1 gazillion.
Well, yeah, that's because you need the parentheses. Order of operations. What did you think happened whenever you like drug stuff down? Oh, it's always done on paper.
When you do the BC using have a question. Do you want to know?
So let's talk through kind of the findings here a little bit. So the initial costs were already in a present value. So we didn't need to do any formula to change that. We just copied the data over. Everything else was on an annual basis, and therefore when we're using the PV function, we put the amounts into the PMT field because those are payments, as you know, that's what Excel calls an annual series. So we don't use the double comma here because if we did, then it would treat this as a single lump sum amount 75 years in the future. But what we really want to know is if there are 75 annual payments, what's the present value of that now? So we're putting the amounts into the PMT field. And I already told you about the trick of combining a function within a function so that then, you know, for the benefits, we could put the fire, flood, and recreation, all of them together. So of the conventional B to C ratios, since option E was less than 1, we reject it, and we're not going to bother doing any incremental analysis with option E because just in absolute terms, it is not an acceptable alternative. But what do you notice of these ratios? E was the, option D was the lowest, but then through the incremental analysis, that's the one that we found out was the best. So we're not trying to maximize B to C ratio. We're trying to maximize the amount of benefit that's being done at, we want to capture all the benefit that can be purchased for less than $1 in cost for $1 in benefits. And so we couldn't know just from the conventional which alternative was best. We had to do the incremental analysis. And for that, when we started off, you begin with the cheapest alternative. So A versus B. So the cheapest versus the next most cheapest. And option B actually has less disbenefits. And so the delta D is negative. And don't let that throw you off. That's okay. That just means that going from option B to option A, there's fewer disbenefits. So that's part of what makes option B so powerful compared to option A. It had a really high delta B to C ratio. So what you should do is not only say which one should be selected of the two, but also remind the evaluator and yourself what the criteria is. So an answer is only complete if you've got the numerical data to support it, a statement of the answer, and also stating what was the criteria that led you to that conclusion. So you need to state the decision criteria here. So we start with B versus A, select B because the ratio is larger than 1. In the C versus B matchup, the ratio is less than 1, which means reject the more expensive alternative. So our final matchup is D versus B. And there the incremental ratio is 1.12, so that means D is the best, and we had already rejected E, so there's no more matchups for us to do. So that's the final answer. The final answer is option D is the best alternative. So anybody have questions about the first part of this in-class exercise where we're trying to identify which alternative is best? It's almost certain that you'll have an exam problem like this. Whether it's on the final or exam 2, it would be very shocking if you don't have an exam problem like this. I haven't written the exam yet, so I can't promise you. And I'm so forgetful. If I did promise you, I'd probably forget that I'd made that promise. But just looking back in past semesters, it seems like there's always something like this. So this was part 1, question 1. Now for question 2, we'll just make a copy of it so that we don't have to tinker with what we've already done. Because question 2 is asking, remember, everything depends on interest rates. If interest rates go up, then these projects are less feasible than they otherwise would be, because all of the benefits accrue in the future, but the majority of the costs are at the present. So if you have a high interest rate, what that's doing is it's saying the future benefits are worth less in today's terms. So question 2 asks, what's the highest interest rate that could still be used and still have an alternative with an acceptable B to C ratio? So acceptable means greater than 1 for these. And so we start at 6%. What if we had 8%? All right, there's still an acceptable option if rates go up to 8%. What if rates go up to 10%? Still an acceptable option. 12? Okay, we're starting to lose alternatives as the interest rates go up. If it goes up to 14, we're just barely hanging on here with option B, which at 14.5% is just marginally above 1. And so we'd say that like the interest rates can go up as high as 14.5%, and there will still be an acceptable alternative. It will be alternative B, which will have B to C equal to 1. All right, so that answers question 2, which is what is the highest interest rate that could be used and still have an alternative that's acceptable.